before I go into that, I just want to focus on today, the significance of today, tomorrow, and the day after tomorrow. Today is the 8th day of Tibet. Tomorrow is the 9th, and the next day, of course, is the 10th. Now, these 3 days are considered to be sad days, and we fast on the 3rd day, on the 10th of Tibet, and in the past, there were people who would fast on the 8th and 9th as well. 3 historical events coincide with these 3 days, and they all have a connection, direct or indirect, to the topic that we're discussing, the final redemption, the coming of Meshiach, the rebuilding of the Holy Temple. The reason why we focus on these events, and I'll soon explain what they are, is to generate within ourselves a yearning for the redemption, for the rebuilding of the temple. We don't believe in grieving over something that happened in the past for the sake of grieving alone. We grieve for the past in order to rebuild for the future. We know what we're missing, so we know what we have to do. What we're missing is the Holy Temple, the Beit HaMikdash, and this should develop within us a sense of yearning to do whatever we can do to help rebuild it. And that eventually, in the Messianic Age, all these sad days will be transformed into holidays. That's a biblical verse, that all the sad days, the days that were designated as fast days, will all be transformed into joyous celebrations. So the more sad days we have, the more celebrations we will have. We could look at it that way. So it's a bittersweet, it's half sad and half joyous, because if we look into the future, we know it's going to be very, very positive. Now let's go through these 3 days. Today, the 8th day, is the day that the Torah was translated into Greek. King Ptolemy II, the king in Egypt, who succeeded Alexander the Great, wanted to expand his library, and he knew he did not have a copy of the Jewish Torah. He was a very enlightened person, and he wanted more books. So he commissioned 72 rabbis to come to Alexandria and translate the Torah from Hebrew into Greek. And he took these 72 rabbis, he put them into 72 different rooms, and they all translated the Torah identically, which was a miracle. And not only that, but in 13 places, they decided to change the text because they thought if the text would be translated as it is written, he would misunderstand, and this would cause some negative repercussions. I'll give you an example. The word in the Torah, when the Torah talks about a non-kosher animal, one of those animals is called arnevet, a rabbit. Well, the Greek word for rabbit was the name of Ptolemy's wife. So they were concerned that he's going to read about unclean animals, and one of them is his wife. That wouldn't be politically correct. That was just one of the 13 things. And the Talmud says something very strange. That this day was as bad or as difficult for the Jewish people as the day in which they created the golden calf. It doesn't say it was as bad as worshiping the golden calf, but it was as bad as the day in which the golden calf was worshipped. What does that mean? That means that translating the Torah into Greek in and of itself was not a negative thing, but it became negative. Instead of bringing the light of Torah to the Greeks, it introduced the Jews to Greek culture. And a century or so later, you have the story of Hanukkah, where the Greeks tried to totally impose their will on the Jewish people and get rid of Judaism and have the Jews adopt Greek culture. And it's interesting, they changed the Torah in 13 places. In the story of Hanukkah, we know that the Assyrian Greeks broke the temple partition. There was a partition, I mentioned this, I think, last week or the week before. They punched 13 holes into one of the walls of the Beit HaMikdash, of the Holy Temple. So the Rebbe suggests that the seeds for that type of destruction were sown when they translated the Torah into Greek, and they had to alter 13 things. So that day is considered to be a sad day because it's a day that ultimately led to the Greeks defiling of the Holy Temple. It were the seeds that were sown for that. That's today, the 8th day. Tomorrow, the 9th day of Tibet, is the anniversary of the passing of Ezra. Ezra was the greatest Jewish leader of his time, of centuries before and after him. He brought the Jewish people back to Israel after the Babylonian exile. And he is credited with the building of the Second Temple, although technically he didn't build the Second Temple. But for all intents and purposes, he was the one who made the Second Temple a great source of spiritual influence, and he too was the great teacher of his time, and compared in many ways even to Moses. So he passed away on this day, the 9th day of Tevet, and we're told in the Talmud that the day that a righteous person passes away is like the destruction of the temple. So this too relates to the temple's destruction in one way or another. The 10th of Tevet, which is a fast day even today, that will be Tuesday, is the anniversary of the siege of Jerusalem by Nebuchadnezzar, the Babylonian king. The Babylonians destroyed the first temple, but before they destroyed it, they besieged the city of Jerusalem, and that siege ultimately led to the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple. And that's what this day is all about. So we have 3 sad days, but there's also a positive message in all these 3 days. Because translating the Torah into Greek, if it was accepted and embraced the right way, would bring the light of Torah even to the Greeks, even to the rest of the world. Ezra symbolizes the returning of all Jews to Israel, which is one of the Messianic prophecies, that all of the Jewish people will come back to Israel. So Ezra was the first person to actually bring Jews back to Israel. Although it was incomplete in his time, it will be complete in the future. And even the siege of Jerusalem, the Rebbe points out, could have been a positive thing, because when he besieged Jerusalem, all the Jews were united in one city. If the Jews would have taken that physical unity and translated it into spiritual unity, that would have averted the destruction of the temple. So the siege of Jerusalem also has a positive symbol and a positive message. So I'm mentioning these 3 things because when we're talking about how to prepare for the Messianic Age, it's important to understand that every event that we commemorate, every historical event, connects in one way to the future. The message that they convey is a message about how we can help rebuild the Holy Temple in Jerusalem. Now, how do we prepare for Meshiach? The truth is, we started preparing 3,300 years ago at Mount Sinai. That was the first time in history where God allowed the spiritual to merge with the physical. That was the beginning of a process that will take us ultimately to the final redemption. Because what is the final redemption? What exactly are we going to experience that is different? Okay, there'll be peace in the world. That's a great thing, universal peace. We won't have nations fighting with one another. No more bloodshed. No more violence. That's all wonderful. But what will cause that? Waving a magic wand is not going to do it. What will make people change? There's so much violence, so much hatred going on in the world. How are people going to change? And the answer is, the reason why there's violence, why does one person hate another? Because you don't really see who the other person is. You don't see the person's soul. What you see is not the real person. Sometimes you could hate someone's behavior, someone who behaves the wrong way, but when it translates in hating the person, that means you don't really see who that person really is. The reason why there's violence in the world, the reason why there are people who commit crimes, is because they don't have an awareness of God. If you would know, if let's say there's someone who you respect greatly, and you're about to do something that is not so moral, and that person walks into the room, what are you going to do? You're going to stop doing it. You're going to desist because you're embarrassed to do something untoward in the presence of a person who you respect. Now imagine if it's not just a person who you respect, it's God himself appears and reveals himself. How could you even desire to do something that is improper? How would you harm someone else? How could you hate someone else when you're in the presence of God? So what is our problem? Our problem is that we don't see the presence of God in most of our lives. Yes, once in a while we become inspired on Yom Kippur, on Rosh Hashanah, at a very holy event like a wedding, we feel more spiritual. But when we don't feel spiritual, we're capable of doing everything. There's nothing that will stop us because we're not really aware of the presence of God. So what happened at Mount Sinai was the first time God's presence was allowed to enter into the consciousness of the world. So you could say from Mount Sinai onward, we started preparing. But actually it started before Mount Sinai, in the very beginning of creation. It says in the Torah, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the waters. So the Midrash tells us the Spirit of God refers to the Spirit of Meshiach. What does that mean? It means that at the very beginning of creation, God is saying, I want you to know what the goal is. When it says, let there be light, why did God have to create light the first day of creation? There was no one around to enjoy the light or benefit from the light. But it was a mission statement. God is saying, you know why I created this world? I created this world so that eventually the light will permeate the whole world. The whole world will bask in the light and the glory of Hashem, of God. Yehi ar, let there be light. It's not the light that was created that day. That's the mission statement. That's the goal. So at the very beginning of creation, we were already told what our goal is, what our mission is, to bring about the Messianic Age. Okay, so that's at the very beginning of creation. We got the first installment of the spiritual revelation at Mount Sinai. But what do we do now? How do we prepare in these last moments of exile? Actually, we've been preparing since Sinai in so many ways. The Jewish people are an incredible people. What they have accomplished in the course of their history, we gave the world the most important thing that the world has ever been given. The most important thing was not technology. The most important thing was the belief in and awareness of one God, monotheism. Abraham gave us monotheism. We introduced the idea to the whole world. We got rid of idol worship and got the world closer to realizing that there's one God. But it's much more than that. What we have gone through to follow God's commandments makes us eminently worthy of every imaginable reward, and certainly worthy of the Messianic Age. But it's not just that we did things, we did them so heroically. The way Jews sacrificed everything, life and limb, to be good Jews, to observe the commandments. Self-sacrifice is unparalleled. There's no nation on earth that can come close to the Jewish people, because we were chosen by God with a special mission. And in order to be capable of fulfilling that mission, God had to give us certain powers that enable us to go against the tide, to go against all the pressures, and to live as Jews. If Jews forget that they are Jews, and that means that they have a different way of living, then there's no justification for us to be called Jews. And if there's no justification for us to be called Jews, there's no justification for the whole world, for that matter. But we have fared very well. We're not perfect, believe it or not. There are some imperfect people out there, not here, of course. We're not those on the Zoom either. But there are some imperfect people outside, and they may be Jewish as well. But as a whole, as a nation, we have been preparing and paving the way for the redemption in passing every test imaginable. But nevertheless, we're still not there. We're still in a period which we call galut, golah, exile. There still is suffering in this world. There still is negativity, animosity, violence. There are even people who deny God's existence, which is the most heinous crime that a person could be guilty of. Although you can't blame people because they didn't get the education to know that this is a heinous crime. But if someone is your benefactor, someone saves your life, gave you life, is constantly taking care of every one of your needs, created you, and you don't recognize that that person exists, that would be the ultimate insult. Well, that's God. God is the one who creates us, who gives us life and sustenance. If we're not aware of his presence in our lives, that's the greatest insult. So the Jewish people have managed very well, but we still are in this exile where you can have the most negative things happening. So how do we push us over the top? So I made a list of different things that the Talmud, the Midrash, the Zohar, Hasidic works, and last but not least, the Rebbe told us what we have to do to push us over the top. And the Rebbe would say, any mitzvah you do, it doesn't make a difference. Any one mitzvah could take us over. And to understand how that works, it's very simple. We have, when we look at the world before the redemption and after the redemption, it can be compared to a woman who's pregnant before she gives birth and when she gives birth. The Exodus from Egypt is likened in the biblical writings as the birth of the Jewish people. So the Messianic Age is likewise considered to be the birth. Now, what happens if a woman is 9 months pregnant and the baby has not yet been born? You know that one little movement could make that happen. If it's the 3rd month, of course, not only you don't want it to happen, but it's not easy to make it happen. But if it's already the end of the 9th month, anything could make it happen, can make this birth happen. So it could be any mitzvah. Maimonides says you have to look at the whole world as if it's evenly balanced between good and bad. And by one feather of a mitzvah, he doesn't use that analogy, but I'll use it anyhow. Even a feather of a mitzvah, it'll tip the scale and save the world. So one mitzvah, and any one mitzvah can make a difference. But nevertheless, there are specific mitzvahs, specific actions that are suited even more to bring about the redemption. Number one, We're talking about now attitudes. The mere yearning for redemption. In other words, if you show God, I want it. Well, let's put it in the negative. If you don't show God you want the redemption, God may say, you don't want it? Well, I'm not going to force you to have a good life. You want to live in misery? You want to live in an exile? You're satisfied with that? So be it. When you show that you want something, God will give it to you. That's why we pray in general. Why do we pray? God knows what we need. But if we don't know what we need and we don't care about what we need, then God says, why should I give it to you? I may give it to you, I may not give it to you. When you pray, you're asking God for something because you know it's a great need, and then God will give it to you. In our prayers, we say that we yearn and we're anxious for the redemption, and that is the catalyst for redemption itself. One of the great Jewish luminaries of the 20th century, 19th and 20th century, known as the Chafetz Chaim, he said, you're not just supposed to ask for Meshiach, you're supposed to demand it. Because there's a law, if you're an employee, in Jewish law, if you're an employee and your employer doesn't pay you, you can't have complaints unless you ask him for it, unless you demand it. You have to demand your pay if you're an employee. Same way, we have to demand of God, in a respectful way, that he owes it to us. That's what will help bring about the redemption, by showing how much we want it to the point that we're willing to say to God, God, we need it, we demand it, you owe it to us. And it's music to God's ears. You think it sounds disrespectful, it's brazen, it's a lot of chutzpah to come to God and say, God, you better give me this. For two reasons. Number one, it shows that we're sincere, we really want the Messianic Age. But number two, who is suffering in exile? We're suffering, but so is God. There's a biblical verse that says, God says, I'm with you in your distress. When it talks about redemption in the book of Deuteronomy, it says, God will return with you, with your captives. God himself, the Zohar has an expression, Shchinta begaluta, the divine presence is in exile. So when you demand redemption, who are you redeeming? You're redeeming the Jewish people and the whole world, but also God himself. So when you're demanding it, you're not demanding something selfishly, so it's music to God's ears. Going beyond that, you have to have trust. This is not easy. Trust in God. Trust in God is not the same as belief in God, faith in God. You have faith in God is one thing, it's very wonderful, but do you have trust? If someone tells you, I have faith in you, doesn't mean you're going to trust that person if the person asks you for a loan of $100,000. You know, I have faith in you, you're a good person, but $100,000, you know, I'm not so sure you're going to be able to repay it. I don't have that trust. When we talk about God, it's not enough to have faith in God, you have to have trust. And trust is when you don't see how it could happen. That's real trust. So we have to have trust and develop it. It's something that you have to work on it to trust that God will bring us the redemption and bring it imminently.
But it says that Jews we inherit faith but not trust.
Yes, that's true. Trust you have to work on. Faith you also have to work on to nurture the faith, but faith is an innate thing as well. The Rebbe once said something, he said, we tried everything. There's one thing that we haven't tried yet, and that is joy. Pure, unmitigated joy to bring redemption. And the logic behind that is, what is the definition of simcha, Hebrew word for joy? What's the definition of, why is a person happy? That means there are nothing that occludes, nothing that covers up your feelings. When you're depressed, when you're sad, everything is covered up. It's constricted. When you're in a joyous mood, you're open. There's nothing, no boundaries, no barriers. If you want to break the barriers of exile, you have to have joy. And the Rebbe says, not just joy because of some things that cause joy, just pure, unmitigated joy. People should be happy. And that is a power that can bring Mashiach. And you know what? The word Mashiach, if you rearrange the letters, spells Yismach, he will rejoice. Or Yisamach, he will make others rejoice. So joy is another way of bringing. So far we're talking more about attitudes, yearning, demanding, trusting, being happy. But then there are also physical mitzvahs, actions that we do to bring redemption. Perhaps more than anything else, the Rebbe emphasized tzedakah, giving tzedakah, which they translate as charity, but I'm not going to go into the language that tzedakah really doesn't mean charity, it means righteousness, but we'll leave that for another time. But the simple meaning is you're giving money to help someone who's in need, to help a poor person, a needy person, or a needy organization that does good. The Rebbe focused so much on tzedakah that the Rebbe, for the last 5 or so years, would spend every Sunday 7 hours, 8 hours, standing, the age of 89, 90, standing in one place, 7 hours straight, no break for bathroom, no break for some water, and would give $1 to every man, woman, child, Jew, non-Jew that walked by with a blessing. And the Rebbe said the purpose of that $1 is for you to give it, or in exchange, because no one would want to part with $1 you got from the Rebbe, you could exchange it for another $1 and add some more of your own. So on a given Sunday, my estimate is that the Rebbe gave about between $5,000 and $10,000. Well, where did he get that money from? Did he rob a bank to get that money? No, people gave him money to use at his discretion. So instead of giving it to his own organization, he gave 10,000 people every week $1 so that they can give to the charity of their choice and add more of their own. So on a given Sunday, my guess is that hundreds of thousands of dollars were distributed to charity as a result. And then, during the week, the Rebbe would go to the graveside of his father-in-law to pray for everyone who asked him for a blessing. He would stand there 6, 7, 8 hours, uninterrupted. And when he would come back late at night sometimes, he would give a talk. And the day he went to the cemetery, it was a fast day for him. He didn't eat that day. He would give a talk, and after he gave a talk, he would distribute $1 to everyone there. Weren't as many people, maybe not 7,000, 10,000, maybe 1,000, 2,000. And he did this sometimes several times a week. And the Rebbe emphasized the importance of giving tzedakah as a way of bringing about redemption. And it's actually a biblical verse in the book of Isaiah, the very beginning of Isaiah. He says, Zion, b'mishpat tipadeh, b'shaveha b'tzedakah. Zion will be redeemed with justice, which was also translated as with the laws of the Torah. And it's those who return will return through righteousness, through tzedakah. That it's tzedakah that brings back Jews to the land of Israel in the Messianic Age. The Rebbe also emphasized Torah study, particularly the inner dimension of Torah, the mystical teachings of Torah, the Hasidic teachings. Why? Because we're told that when Mashiach will come, Mashiach is referred to sometimes as a king, a great leader, but he's also referred to as a great teacher, just like Moses. Moses was both. Moses was a king. Maybe he didn't wear a crown, but he was the absolute leader of the Jewish people. But he was also known, and even more so, as Moshe Rabbeinu, our teacher Moses. Same thing with Mashiach. He will be a teacher. But what is he going to teach? Who is he going to teach? Everyone, including the greatest scholars. What is he going to teach them that they don't already know? He's going to teach them the mystical secrets of the Torah. So as much as we study those teachings, we're preparing ourselves for the Messianic Age. You see, in preparation, there are two aspects. One aspect is to get rid of the negatives. Now, you want to go visit someone important, and you're all soiled, so what do you do first? You take a shower. And then you get dressed for the occasion. So we also have two types of preparation. One is to get rid of our negatives, and the other one is to get dressed, spiritually speaking. So how do we prepare for the Messianic Age? By studying the teachings of the Torah that are a sample of and a taste of the teachings of Torah of the future. The Talmud makes it very clear that if the Jewish people would observe 2 Sabbaths, another version says even 1 Sabbath, they would observe the Shabbos properly, Meshiach would be here, guaranteed. Specifically, within Shabbat itself, is the lighting of the Shabbos candles. There's Shabbos observance, by resting on Shabbos, and there's the lighting of the Shabbos candles. And it says in the Midrash, when you light the Shabbos candles, I will kindle the lights of Zion, which is a metaphor for I will bring the redemption. So every time you light the Shabbos candles, realize that you're not just bringing light to your home and to your family and to your environment, you're lighting up the world and preparing it for the Messianic Age. There's a very general idea that the Talmud says, and Maimonides codifies this, that if the Jewish people would only do teshuvah means return. What does returning mean? Returning means if you're going on a road and you make a wrong turn, what are you supposed to do? Turn around. Get on the right path. I remember I was once in Florida. I think it was Fort Lauderdale, and I was supposed to go to my daughter and son-in-law's house, and they told me to take Route 95. So I put the first time in my life that I used the GPS, and the GPS was telling me to go straight, and I didn't see Route 95. Finally, after about a half hour of driving, I see a sign, Route 95, make a right. So I make that right, and the GPS tells me, make a U-turn. And I said, no, I'm not making a U-turn. I know I have to go Route 95. So I go another block, make a U-turn here, make a U-turn. After 10 blocks and 10 heavenly voices telling me to make a U-turn, I call up my son-in-law. I realized that where I was before was almost near his house. I had almost reached my destination. But I got off the right path. And I hear a heavenly voice. What does GPS stand for? G is Geula, redemption, positioning system. It tells you how to position yourself for the redemption. So it was telling me, go back, do tshuva, return. But I wasn't going to listen because I was told I need Route 95. So the lesson is, you go off the course, it's not so terrible. You can always go back. Another thing, the Talmud says that every time you bring another child into this world, you bring Mashiach closer. Because Mashiach will come when every soul, there's a place in heaven for souls that haven't been born. When every one of those souls comes into the world, that brings Mashiach closer. So if you can't have children yourself, you could at least promote it that others should have, and not be part of this craziness that we have to reduce the world's population. That's an evil, I'm going to say it openly, it's an evil ideology. We don't have to control the world's population. The more people in the world, the better off the world will be. And there'll be enough food for everyone. Everything that they said about the future, that if we have 2 billion people, everyone will die of starvation. Now we have 7 billion, and we have more food. We can feed everyone in the world 3 times over. We waste so much food because we have so much that we can produce with so little. as opposed to the way things were a century ago, when you needed to do so much for so little. But every child that's born brings us closer to redemption. Then there's another thing. The Talmud says that the reason the Second Temple was destroyed was because of senseless hatred. What does that mean, senseless hatred? If you hate someone because they harmed you, that's not nice. But it's not senseless. There's a reason for it. But if you hate someone's guts just because they exist, and your ego is so big that there's no room for anyone else. There was once a guy who comes to his rabbi and he says, "Rabbi, when I go into the shul, everyone steps on me." So he said, if you wouldn't spread yourself out to cover the entire floor surface of the shul, they would have room to step elsewhere. But you take up the whole shul, they have no other place to step but on you. If your ego is so big, you can't tolerate the existence of others. That's called senseless hatred, and that's what caused the destruction of the Second Temple. So the Rebbe says, so how do you correct that? The antidote for that is senseless love, where you embrace someone not because they're good to you, not because they deserve your love, you just accept them and embrace them. That's the way to correct the senseless hatred. However, the Rebbe said, we're not just doing it to correct the past. Just think for a moment how we're going to live our lives in the Messianic Age. There's not going to be any more hatred in our hearts. So let's get used to not having hatred in our hearts today. Why do we have to wait for it to happen from above when it can come down from below? Another thing the Rebbe focused on very much, there's a story in the Talmud, it's based on the Bible, that there was a siege of Jerusalem by the Assyrian Empire. This is a century or more before the destruction of the first temple. And the king of Israel was Hezekiah. He was considered to be one of the most righteous kings. And God said, I want him to be the Meshiach, but he blew it. Why? Because a miracle happened when the Assyrian Empire's army was destroyed miraculously. He didn't sing praise to God. To him, it was no big deal. God is great. He can do miracles. It didn't excite him. And God says, if I can perform a miracle and you don't get excited, you can't be Meshiach. You have to acknowledge when miracles happen. And there are so many miracles happening today. Every time we see a miracle happening, something in the world that is positive, that is out of the ordinary, we have to make note of it and say to God, thank you for this great miracle. The Rebbe also emphasized when we study Torah to try to find new insights in the Torah, because Meshiach will give us new insights, and therefore we prepare for it by looking, when we study Torah, to delve more deeply into it and to look for new insights. There's a blessing of the new moon. Every month we bless the new moon. Why? Because we're likened to the moon. We're lunatics. We follow the moon. Literally, we follow the moon because the moon waxes and wanes, and our fortune waxes and wanes, but it's going to soon wax and not wane anymore. That's the way the Messianic Age is described, and that's part of the blessing that we say when we bless God for the new moon. We don't bless the moon, we bless God for the new moon, and we talk about how the new moon is the symbol of the renewal of the Jewish people in the Messianic Age. There's one other thing. The Mishnah, in Ethics of the Fathers, says that one of the ways to acquire Torah knowledge is to say things by naming the author, not plagiarizing. If you get something from a source, you should quote the source. And it says, whoever does that brings redemption to the world. And it says that Esther told Achashverosh that there was a plot against his life, and she quoted Mordechai. And that's what caused the whole miracle of Purim. Had she just said, I have some inside information that there's a plot against you, and she took the credit for it, then Mordechai would never have been held in such high regard by the king, and the whole miracle of Purim could have been lost. So you should always quote your sources. And the Rebbe explains that that's also a metaphor, that everything in life, our whole existence has a source, the divine source. We should always be aware of that source. You know, it's sad, but even rabbis today have a hard time talking about God. It's not the in thing to talk about God. I remember there's a producer at NBC. She was a producer. She speaks all over, and she got into Judaism when she was on an assignment in Brazil. And when she came back to her boss, she was afraid to say that she found God, because he would look at her askance. You found God? That's not hip. So instead, she said I think she couched it in terms the force. You know, she used some other popular jargon. People are afraid to talk about God. But that's all Judaism. Judaism is all about God. Everything revolves around God. And when we quote our sources, and the ultimate source, that brings redemption to the world. Because the world, the greatest exile of the world is the world doesn't recognize its true source. The world is in a state of concealment, of obscurity. You're obscuring the reality. I'll have to leave the next part for the next class. So if anyone has any questions on any of these, I'm sure there are more things that can prepare for Mashiach. But as I said at the very beginning, any mitzvah you do, you add another mitzvah, you add another gesture, you do it again, you do it repeated, could be the last thing that we have to do to bring the redemption. Anyone on the Zoom? Someone wrote on the chat, Meshiach Achshav, Meshiach now.
If Meshiach is out there, okay, and he's looking down on us, and he knows that we want him to come.
Yeah, it's not up to him.
Why doesn't he?
The Talmud says that the one who wants to come more than anyone is Meshiach himself. He can't take the pain and suffering of people. There's a story in the Talmud. Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi, one of the great Talmudic sages, used to chat with Elijah the prophet. And he asked Elijah, when is Mashiach coming? So Elijah says, why are you asking me? Ask Mashiach himself. Well, where is he? He hangs out in the entrance of Rome. And he's a beggar. He sits among the beggars who are all lepers. So how will I know which one is Mashiach? He says, you'll look at them. They're all bandaging themselves constantly. So all of the others are going to take off all their bandages and then put on new bandages. Mashiach will only take off one bandage at a time and put on a new bandage, take off another one. Why? Because in case he's called upon to bring the world to redemption, if he takes off all his bandages, he's going to have to wait a few more minutes. He can't handle waiting another few minutes to bring the redemption. So that's why he does one bandage at a time. Anyhow, he finds Mashiach and he asks him, when are you coming? Because in every generation there's someone who was designated to be the Mashiach. He says, I'm coming today. So he runs back to Elijah. He says, great news, Mashiach is coming today. And Mashiach didn't come. So he asks Elijah, what happened? He says, he said today, but that's just the first word of a verse. Today, if you listen to my voice. That God says, if you listen to my voice, he'll come today. But the Rebbe said that was then. Now he comes, we listen to his voice. As a people, we are beyond good, with certain imperfections that do exist, but as a general rule, we are a good people and deserving that Mashiach should come. And the fact that he hasn't yet come makes no sense, the Rebbe would emphasize over and over again. So Mashiach wants to come more than anyone else. So we have to speak to God, because Mashiach is not God. Mashiach is a messenger of God. So we ask God, tell Mashiach to get on his donkey or go on the cloud, which is two different ways Mashiach is described in the biblical literature, is riding on a cloud or riding on a donkey. But we'll talk about that another time. Yes?
So it's my understanding that there are entire sects of the Judaism that don't believe in God anymore. That they basically, there really is no God, but we're still his people. Kind of.
Well,
I mean, that's a joke.
they say that the Reconstructionists
Right.
don't. They say there is no God, but Mordechai Kaplan is his prophet. Or they address the praise to whom it may concern. I don't even know if that's really true. It's hard for me to believe that people could pray and not believe in God. I once heard that a certain Reconstructionist rabbi was totally observant. He put on talit and tefillin, and he always wore a yarmulke, and he ate only kosher, and he observed the Sabbath meticulously, but he was an atheist. So someone asked him, why are you practicing Judaism if you don't believe in God? He said, well, if you're an Indian, you wear feathers. So if you're a Jew, you have to keep Torah and mitzvah. In other words, it's only cultural. There's nothing more to it. If you tell me I don't have to believe that story, you're not a heretic. I find it hard to believe that he would be so observant.
I remember reading in Hadassah magazine an article that was all about why you should believe in God. That was the article.
Right. I heard that there was a poll taken of Reform rabbis, and they said 50% said they didn't believe in God.
But if any of them were on the operating table, they would believe in God because
I'm sure they would.
there's no atheists on the operating table.
Right, I'm sure they would. I don't. When someone once said, I think it was to my son. Maybe I'm confusing with another story. I don't believe in God, and my son says, I don't believe in atheists.
I believe in the God that you.
Oh yeah, that's something else. The God that you don't believe in, I don't believe in either.
My favorite Tom Poles cartoon, and I wish I had cut it out, was it says, what do you mean there's no prayer in school? And there's a little boy sitting at his desk going, please God, let me pass this math test.
I have a question.
Yes.
We're a teeny tiny group of people out of the entire world's population.
Not if you read the newspapers or
That's true.
listen to the media.
But-
You know, in China, some people, and government officials in China, were convinced that there were a few 100 million Jews.
I'm sure they were.
All right, so the question I have though is, I think I haven't been here for all of your classes. What is our role or the role of other cultures and faiths to bring about this Messiah or the Messianic Age? Is it only the Jews'
No.
responsibility, the Catholics, the Buddhists, the Muslims? I mean, there are millions of others, and we're this tiny group, and
Okay, that's a
it's
good
unnerving,
point.
But also, that's one piece. The other thing is there's a group of Jews called humanistic. This could be the group that this.
It could be. Right.
Okay, thank you. There's a question about.
Okay, we are here for the whole world, and God is here for the whole world. He wouldn't have created people if they didn't have a role. He might have created animals or plants or inanimate things that don't have a active role because they're not sentient beings. But God would not create a sentient being, a being that has intelligence and could choose right from wrong, and say, you don't have a purpose, you're just there to take up space. Every human being is a messenger of God to fulfill his purpose. But the Jewish people were chosen from that grouping of individuals, of humans, with a special mission, a more intense mission, a more dangerous mission, a more comprehensive mission. In general, the mission of humanity, which includes every human being, is to fulfill the 7 Noahide commandments, which, if you look at what links all of the 7 Noahide commandments, it's the idea of making this world a inhabitable world, a civilized world, a clean, moral world. That's the role of every human being, not just the Jewish people. And that's why I don't like the expression tikkun olam, because it makes it sound like that's a Jewish thing. No, it's not a Jewish thing. That's a universal thing. Jewish people have a much greater role than just tikkun olam. If tikkun olam means to get rid of injustice, to get rid of crime, and that's every human being has a responsibility to make this world a civilized world. We have if we use the term tikkun olam, we have to finish the end of that sentence. Tikkun olam b'malchut, and the word, I don't want to pronounce it, is God the Almighty, to make the whole world recognize there's one God. That's our role. And to make sure that the rest of the people know what their role is, that their role is to make the world a better world. That's the Jewish responsibility, to the extent that we're able to. Now, it's interesting that for most of our history, if a Jew would dare tell a non-Jew what his role in this world is, he could put his life in danger. Jews were not allowed to preach anything. As late as the 19th century, a Jew could have been murdered for preaching religion to a non-Jew. We're no longer in that situation. So the Rebbe emphasized very strongly that we should, whenever we have an interaction with non-Jews, we should talk to them about the 7 Noahide commandments. And it had reverberation all over the world. There are groups everywhere in the world where they're not Christian. They used to be Christians. They're no longer Christians. They believe in one God and no Trinity. They believe in the Torah, but they don't want to be Jewish. I officiated at a Ben Noach wedding a number of years ago. There were 2 students who, I think they went to a college in Columbus, Ohio, and they were interested in Judaism, and they were thinking of converting to Judaism. Then they realized that Judaism was like too demanding for them, so they decided they're going to become B'nai Noach, descendants of Noah, Noahides, whatever word is used. And they wanted to get married. They lived in the Western New York area, and they asked me. I don't even know how they got in touch with me. I think it was a rabbi in Pittsburgh who's a leader of this group who got in touch with me and asked me if I could officiate at their wedding. Now, there's no such thing as you don't need a rabbi to officiate at the wedding, but they liked the idea, and they had 7 people light candles, and every candle corresponded to one of the 7 Noahide commandments, and it was a very beautiful thing. They wrote a ketubah, one that corresponded to what the Noahides would be required to do. And I think it was the first and only time that a rabbi officiated at a Ben Noach wedding. At any rate, that's our role. So Meshiach is going to come for the whole world. The question you may be asking, will everyone become Jewish? And according to Maimonides and most others, no.
Will they all become this Ben Noach?
No, Jews will remain Jews.
But will the non-Jews become the
Yes,
Ben
they'll all
Noach?
be B'nai Noach.
No more Christians, Muslims, or Hindus. They'll all be
Any religion. I was asked this question. I was once on a panel. There was this sounds like a joke. There was a priest, there was a minister, there was an imam, there was a Hindu guru, whatever the title they give, and I was on that panel. So they asked each one of the people, I'm glad I was the last, what do you think about the other religions? And everyone was lying through their teeth. The priest was saying, oh, we respect all religions and everything. They're all different paths to the same end. I know he wasn't telling the truth. That's not what he believes in. And so that when they asked me the question, I said that to the extent that a religion conforms to the 7 Noahide commandments, then that religion will remain. To the extent that it doesn't, I remember saying also, I said 3 is not 1. We can get along. We can be we can accept each other, embrace each other, love each other, but it doesn't mean I have to think that your religion is a legitimate religion. No, we don't believe there's three gods, there's one God. I said, but to the extent that your religion conforms with the 7 Noahide commandments, it'll be around. If it doesn't, it won't be around.
They didn't like that answer, did they?
I don't know. They kept inviting me. I never went back because I didn't see any purpose in going.
What are the
I'm not
seven-
trying to convert them. They may have intentions of converting me, but I wasn't interested in converting them.
What are the 7 commandments?
What are they?
Yes,
Number 1, not to worship other gods.
okay.
Number 2, not to be blasphemous towards God, not to curse God, something that people often do when they get upset. They vent their anger and frustration with God. Number 3, not to eat an animal without first killing the animal. Apparently in ancient times, and I think in China they still do that, they will cut off a piece of the animal while it's still alive and roast it or whatever. So in other words, that's an emblematic of not being cruel to animals. Number 4, not to commit any form of theft. That's a very broad category. Theft doesn't just mean going over to someone and grabbing something from them. Fraud in business, anything that defrauds someone. Number 5 is not to commit murder. Number 6 is not to commit sexual crimes. It includes adultery, incest, and others. And number 7 is a very broad one, to establish courts or a judicial system that will take care of the society's needs. So that is a very wide and category of. In other words, if you have a society where there's anarchy, they're a violation of one of the 7 commandments. You can't have anarchy in a society. So it's really more than 7, because in the enumeration of 613 that we have, theft, there can be 10 forms of theft. There's the thief who just grabs something from you, the thief who is a burglar who comes into your house secretly. There's the employer who cheats his employee. There's the person who was given something to guard and he denies that he has it. Person who borrows money and doesn't repay it, doesn't want to repay it, and could repay it. So theft is more than what? Kidnapping is a form of theft, obviously. So so in the 613, there can be 10 different commandments. When we talk about the 7 here, we put it in one category. So it's a lot more than 7, actually. Yes.
So they don't include honoring the parents?
Yeah, that's a good question. Interestingly, it doesn't include honoring the parents, but the Rebbe suggests that honoring parents may be considered part of the establishing of courts, a judicial system, to make sure that society doesn't fall apart. If you have no respect for your elders, parents in particular, that look what's happening in places where people don't have parents. The violence in Chicago, for example, you're talking about the murder rate, and most of those people don't have normal families. The assault on the family is an assault on the stability of society. So that may not be a separate commandment, but it could be included. Also, tzedakah, charity, is not one of the 7. So the Rebbe again suggests, and he bases it on an earlier source, that it's included in the 7th commandment. The 7th commandment is very broad.
It's not really part of the 10 Commandments either.
No, but we have 613 commandments, and tzedakah is one of them, for sure.
But it's included, but it's not
No, it's mentioned specifically in Deuteronomy. It's mentioned a few times.
in the actual 10 Commandments.
Not the 10 commandments, no.
No, well, I'm just saying.
10 commandments is just a grouping. It's not even 10 commandments, it's 10 statements.
I know.
It's just a grouping of commandments among all the 613.
I know.
Yeah. But the mitzvah to give tzedakah for a non-Jew may actually be included in one of the other categories, one of the others. It's certainly something that we encourage. Okay? Oh, 1 second. Someone said, we're not a religion, we're a nation with a divine lifestyle based on divine directives. That's very true. We're not a religion. However you define religion, Judaism is more than just a religion, let's put it that way. Someone else asked another question, but for me to explain the question would take 15 minutes to give you the background, so we'll have to leave it for another time. Okay?
Thank you.